up like Samson. Don't end up like Samson. Pastor asked me to preach last week, and I already had something kind of on my mind for a while. I don't know if you ever look at the side notes that you write down during preaching as you're reading your Bible through in your daily Bible reading. But I had some notes written down here that I remember pretty vividly when I wrote them down, and I even remember what God was working on me at the time. And I've never really been one of those note-taking people. I remember growing up and in our local Christian school, we had some pretty good note takers. I remember, every now and then kids would leave their Bibles there, so I'd look in, if it was, some of the kids in our school there. Some of those kids took some great notes. And I remember looking at my Bible, I got like a couple squiggles here and a couple squiggles there. And I don't know, I've never really been a great big note taker. And I think that may have been partly my fault. Well, it is my fault, but mainly because I never really had to study much in school. I would take a test, and I'd probably study for 5 minutes before the test, and I would get an A or a B. And that's just kind of a gift that I guess the Lord gave me. So when I write down notes in my Bible and I look at them, it's usually a stop and ponder. So I was looking at this note I had written down in my Bible. As we come to verse number 21, I wrote down 4 points for tonight's message. And the message I heard as a young man that got a hold of my attention was this in verse number 21. But the Philistines took him and put out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with fetters of brass, and he did grind in the prison house. So here was the 4 points that I got tonight. Samson was bald. Samson was blind. Samson was bound. And Samson was grinding. He was bald, blind, bound, and grinding. But Samson wasn't always this way. He used to have long hair at one point in his life, but by the time we come to verse number 21, his long hair is gone. Samson used to see well, probably as good as each one of us, some of us not so much, but now he couldn't see at all. Samson used to be free, but now he's bound. He used to be able to do whatever he wanted, but now, for the rest of Samson's life, he was grinding. So tonight I want to take a mountaintop view of how I believe Samson ended up bald, blind, bound, and grinding. So here we go, point number 1. Samson was bald because he had no shame. Samson was bald because he had no shame. How many of you have ever been bald at one point in your life? Not hereditary baldness, but you either made a choice maybe. In college we had bus promotions where if we got so many kids on the bus workers would shave their head. One time they tried drafting me in on that. I said, if we get 600 kids on this bus that fits 40, I'll do it. Whoop, clean bald. We never did, surprisingly, but maybe I see videos of men shaving their head bald when they find out their wife has cancer and she has to go through chemo. That's kind of touching. Maybe growing up, your dad knew one haircut, and that was zero, no guard, bald. That's kind of how my cousins were growing up. Their dad didn't know any other haircut besides no guard, and they were always bald. But I remember one time when I was in kindergarten, we had a lice infestation or outbreak at our local elementary school. And I ended up getting it. And it's going to be hard for you to believe, but I had long black hair when I was in kindergarten. And my sister got the lice a few days before me, and I remember my mom buying her this special bottle of shampoo. And I remember the few days before I got it, I remember saying, Mom, that smells really good. I'd like to use that. And she says, no, you can't use this. It's expensive. So I remember when I got lice, I was kind of happy as a kindergarten. I'm like, oh man, I'm going to go home, and Mom's going to let me use her special shampoo. And I remember going home, and I walk in the door, and my mom says, right to the bathroom. It's like, okay. I went in and got in the tub, but she didn't let me use her shampoo. She had a razor waiting for me, and I mean, she shaved my head clean bald, like Mr. Clean Bald, like even polished it up a little. No, she didn't polish it up. That's what it felt like. But I remember as she cut my hair, I remember crying as I saw the long strands of hair fall to the floor. And I remember looking in the mirror afterwards. I had this feeling. I was a little ashamed of how I looked, a little embarrassed, humbled, if you will. And I remember the next day, you know what I went to school with on my head? A hat. And I never wore hats. 1 Corinthians 11:14 says, though, it is a shame for a man to have long hair, and that is true. But it was just the opposite in Samson's case. See, Samson was a Nazirite from birth. And he had some pretty strict rules to follow. He couldn't eat anything from the vine, as you probably remember. He couldn't come upon a dead carcass. And the last one, he couldn't shave his head. And usually this would be for a certain time period, but Samson was a Nazirite his whole life. So as long as Samson was alive, guy never shaved his head. So how did Samson become bald? Look with me real quick over at Judges chapter 14 and verse number 5. Just a few chapters back. Judges chapter 14 and verse number 5. Says, then went Samson down and his father and his mother to Timnath, and came to the vineyards of Timnath, and behold, a young lion roared against him. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and he rent him as he would have rent a kid, and he had nothing in his hands, but he told not his father or his mother what he had done. So Samson goes to a vineyard. Why? Well, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why somebody goes to a liquor store, does it? I mean, it doesn't take a genius to figure out why somebody pulls into a casino and walks inside. So Samson's more than likely in there eating grapes. So even if he wasn't, he's in a place he shouldn't have been. Then came a lion. Here's a free fun fact for you. Don't be surprised when the devil, as a roaring lion, is waiting to ambush you, and you're in places you have no business being in. Samson kills a lion. Look what it says in verse number 8. It says, and after a time, he returned to take her, and he turned aside to see the carcass of the lion. And behold, there was a swarm of bees and honey in the carcass of the lion. And he took thereof in his hand and went on eating, and came to his father and his mother, and he gave them, and they did eat. But he told not them that he had taken the honey out of the carcass of the lion. So here we have it. Samson goes back to the vineyard he's not supposed to be in. He finds the dead lion he's not supposed to be around. And he takes honey and eats happily the sin he's involved in. And he even goes a step further and he gives it to his parents. His sin honey. He's got no shame. Samson, how did he end up bald? I wasn't ashamed of my sin. Job chapter 34, verse 37 says, He addeth rebellion to his sin, he clappeth his hands and saith, I have done nothing wrong. How many of you guys remember as a kid mom baking cookies? Anybody's mom ever baked cookies as a kid? I don't know if your mom was like mine, but she'd always say, hey, those cookies are for later. Don't eat any of those. I remember one time as a little kid, I waited till mom was gone, and I got up there and grabbed a cookie, and man, I smashed that cookie as fast as I could. She comes out, and obviously there's one cookie missing from the little baking rack that she had put it on. And she said, hey, who ate my cookie? My sister turned around, wasn't me. I turned around, wasn't me, and I got chocolate all over my face. My mom said, what's that all over your face? Nothing. But it's just like the same thing. Clapping your hands and saying, I haven't done anything wrong. It wasn't that bad. I wonder if that's what Samson thought. Well, it's not that bad. Just a little, honey's all right. Samson was bald because he had no shame. Samson was blind. Say, how did Samson end up blind? Point number 2, he set his eyes towards places he shouldn't have looked, and he had no business looking at. Chapter number 13, if you will, verse number 25, says, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move him at times in the camp of Dan between Zorah and Eshtaol. And Samson went down to Timnath and saw a woman in Timnath of the daughters of the Philistines. Samson went looking for a spouse in places he shouldn't have been. Here's a fun fact for you. If you're somewhere in between Zorah and Eshtaol, if you go to Timnath, it's about 6 miles or so. Remember, they didn't have cars back then. So about 6 miles walking would have took you about 2.5 hours to walk there. So Samson takes off walking 2.5 miles to a place that wasn't part of Israel, where the Philistines were encamped, and he had to walk 2.5 hours back. Samson, what were you doing there? Well, we know that he went to a vineyard. I bet Samson never hung out at a vineyard back in, Zorah, because they knew that he was a Nazirite there. And let's just, for church's sake, let's just call Samson a Christian. Hey, they knew that he was a Christian there. He was hanging out with people he shouldn't hang out with. That they didn't know he's a Nazirite. Obviously, you can tell by reading the story that even his second wife didn't even know he was a Nazirite until he had to tell her. The teenagers, listen to me carefully. You won't find anything worthwhile in a bar. You won't find happiness in drugs. Listen to me now. You won't find perfect spouse in places you shouldn't be at. Samson, how'd you lose your eyes? I went looking for something in places I shouldn't have been at. Samson was bald. Samson was blind. And Samson was bound. We remember in verse number 21. Say, why was Samson bound? He hooked up with the wrong crowd. Look at verse number 10. Chapter number 14, it says, so his father went down into the woman, and Samson made there a feast, for so used the young men to do. And it came to pass, when they saw him, that they brought 30 companions to be with them. And Samson said unto them, I will now put forth a riddle unto you. If you can certainly declare it me within the 7 days of the feast, and find it out, then I will give you 30 sheets and 30 changes of garments. The sad part is, Samson never realized that one day these friends would try and kill him that he had here at the feast. What's that famous phrase that teenagers always use, Brother Josh? But they're my friends, though. They love me, right? That's like the common phrase that teenagers say. And I'll be honest with you, I said it as a teenager too. They're my friends, though. They love me. They would never hurt me. Samson made a feast for these guys. He just wanted to fit in. You keep reading, you'll find out that his friends never truly cared about him. Say, Brother Caleb, not my worldly friends. My friends, they care about me. Oh, Christian. It's not the church people that try and get you to miss church. It's not the church people that try and get you to take your first drink. It's not the church people that try and get you to listen to that trash music. At least it wasn't for me growing up. And slowly, like Samson, you're binding your hands, being bound in sins that stick with you for a long time. And before long, you're stuck. You're hooked. You're addicted. Before long, you can't get those songs out of your head. Samson, how did you become bound? One day, he hooked up with the wrong friends. Samson was bald. Samson was blind. Samson was bound. Samson was grinding. For the rest of Samson's life, he was going around in circles, accomplishing nothing. All Samson wanted in life was a little joy, a little happiness. But instead, because of the bad choices he made, he was stuck going in circles, bald, blind, bound, and grinding, accomplishing nothing. Samson, why are you grinding for? Because I didn't make my covenant with God my focus. And man, that's so true. I could tell you story after story of teenagers that I knew. There was 3 teenagers in my youth group, my best friends growing up. Josh, Jared, and Jack. We all surrendered to preach at the same time. I remember one day, Jared said, I'm not going to church anymore. And I remember telling him, I was like, Jared, you surrendered to preach, man. And I was a little older. I was like 19 at the time. And I said, Jared, you signed on the dotted line, man. You told God you'd do it. A year later, he died in a motorcycle accident. And I hate that. I still talk to my other buddies, and we talk about it all the time. But many times teenagers do that. Adults do that. We tell God we'll do something, and then we try and backpedal. If you tell God you're going to do something, do it. If you say, God, this is what I'm going to do, do it. Don't backtrack. But I'm glad the story doesn't end there for Samson. Look with me real quick over at verse number 22 of chapter 16. Chapter 16, verse number 22. Says, howbeit, the hair of his head began to grow again after he was shaven. Samson finally started getting a little God back. His eyes are still gone. Sometimes you still have scars from sin when you become an adult. That's why teenagers, Brother Josh preaches to you so hard, because he doesn't want you to grow up with scars. His eyes were still gone, but he was no longer bald. He was no longer bound. Samson stopped grinding. And God was still able to use Samson to accomplish great things.